So January is an exhausting month for a lot of people. So exhausting that January even has a day called Blue Monday. It's labeled as the most depressing day of the year. It's the day of the year where people have noticed that there tends to be a common mood slump that happens. Christmas is over. Usually holiday time has ended. Work is work. If you live here, it's dark and cold. And so a sense of blueness sets in. Blue Monday is always the third day of January. So this year it's January 19th, if you'd like to put that on your calendars and prepare for it by, listening to sad songs and watching sad movies. But the reality is, today there is probably a lot of us here that feel a little blue or a little tired. It's fascinating watching how late you all were for church today. I think that's a symptom of that feeling, to be totally honest. But it could also be that it's more than a mood slump connected to circumstances. Maybe even if it was May or July, you'd still be here weary and maybe late. Because maybe the post-Christmas deep winter blues aren't actually the problem. Maybe today you're exhausted from trying to be a good Christian. Perhaps today you will then come to see that you're tired because you've been trying to do a job that God never gave you to do. Today we begin an adventure that will take us a couple of years to finish. I can't, as Pastor Brianne said, call this a series because it's too big to be a series. Probably the best description would be an endeavor. And that endeavor we are calling 66 Scripture in Full. And my hope and my prayer by God's grace is to introduce this church to every single book in the Bible. When my time on earth has ended, if I can say I've done that in a church I pastored, I think that will matter to me and maybe to some of you too. Now, the plan is this: to do a sermon on each biblical book and to find a key passage or two within that book and to connect the story that is being told in that book to the bigger biblical narrative, and then especially to find the connection to Jesus. And I did it last week. I don't know why I always pick on Nahum, but we're going to see if we can find Jesus in the book of Nahum. Things like that. We won't do all 66 in a row, I'm sure to your relief. We will do it in sections. So the Bible is on purpose divided into certain sections, and I will try to attack this by looking at it pieces at a time like that. And we will pause from time to time to do other sermon series, and especially to stop on important Christian days like Easter, Palm Sunday, Pentecost, things like that. Each section of 66, I think, will be something like a journey within the big adventure. And our first journey then this morning is to walk through the first five books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, everyone's favorite, Leviticus, followed by everyone's second favorite, Numbers. And then we get a little breathing room when we hit Deuteronomy. Now, in Jewish tradition, these first five books are called the Torah. We usually translate the word Torah as law. That's fine, but I actually think that misses the heart of these books. And I don't know, maybe it's just me, but the word law doesn't spark a ton of interest in potential readers. Like, unless you are like a lawyer, an attorney, or maybe like you're a huge John Grisham fan and you just can't get enough of, litigation. And so you think, the 5 books of law, well, that's right up my alley. Maybe I'll read that. The good news is that the Torah is far more than an ancient legal document. So much more than that. The word Torah better means instruction, teaching. It's more like a record of a father teaching his children how to live in the world that they are in. In the Greek world, these same books were called the Pentateuch. Penta coming from 5. It means 5-volume work, these 5 books. You may have heard these books called the books of Moses, which is fair. It is likely, at least tradition holds, that Moses wrote the majority of the content that is found in these 5 books. Whichever your preferred name, it does not really matter. What is far more important than picking the right title is coming to see why all of Scripture comes from the truth and the record of, in fact, these books. For example, you cannot understand Exodus without Genesis. You cannot understand the holiness of God that makes the cross of any significance if you don't understand Leviticus. And so we begin with the beginning, the book of Genesis. The book of Genesis is a book of origins. It's a book of beginning. It's a book of startups. And it's possible you're the type of person here, we all know these people, who want to eat the dessert before the dinner. Maybe you like to read the end of the book before you read the beginning, or you like to know how the movie ends before you start watching it, so you know what you can expect. And so it could be that the idea of reading the beginning when we already have the end seems like a chore at best, more than it is an opportunity. And I get that. I think I felt that way at one time in my life. But Genesis is so much more than a preface to the good stuff. It's actually one of my very favorite books in the entire Bible. It's also so much more than just a collection of beginning stories or moral stories of biblical heroes that tell us to have, the faith of Abram and the integrity of Joseph. It is so much more than that. Genesis is a story about God's father heart, our sin, struggle, blood, promise, hope, and blessing. The bottom line is this is the story of God bringing humanity back to the home that he created for them. Paradise lost, and what are we going to do about it? So if we were to put Genesis in a sentence, we would say this. It's a book that tells us about God's plan to reconcile his people to himself, shouldering the cost of perfect obedience on our behalf. I think that there's value in distilling these big themes, books, whatever it may be, into smaller bite-sized portions. I took a class on Ephesians a few years ago, and the professor in that class did something that I thought was fantastic. He kept repeating the same phrase constantly. Lecture after lecture after lecture, he would use the same phrase to describe Ephesians. And I remember thinking at the time, wow, I'm actually remembering this. I'm actually taking something out of these lectures, and I still remember it today. I could rehearse it for you now. I won't. We're not talking about Ephesians, but I could. And so I think that it's helpful to break it down. And so we've got it in a sentence, but I also want to give it to you in 3 phrases. And maybe as you move through this morning, you'll keep this in your mind as I try to help you to do so, but perhaps even on your own. So first, the Father designed it. Genesis 1 and 2. Genesis opens with a God who doesn't just make things, he designs them on purpose. It isn't chaos. It's the ordering of chaos. This is not an accident. It is a world built on purpose, where humans walk with God and reflect his image as they do his work as his partners on the earth. You remember our Divine Desire series? Just as God has a team in heaven that do his work, he created a family on earth to do his work here. And so we see that taking place. And God looks at it and he says of everything he sees, this is very good. Father designed it. But the next movement is that humanity disrupted it. If God designs the mosaic that is the world, we as people are the ones who put our fist through it and shattered the whole thing. Through the fall, through the first murder where Cain kills Abel, the flood, Babel, we don't just break a rule, we actually break the world that God made. And we discover something that isn't just uncomfortable, it's a calamity. This is now our biggest problem. We're separated from God and we are completely incapable of fixing the problem. Humanity disrupted it. And then third, the covenant secured it. When the design is ruined, God doesn't wait for humanity to clean things up because they couldn't. And so God makes a movement, he makes a decision, and he enters into a covenant promise relationship with a man named Abram. And God amazingly carries the full weight of the promise that he makes on himself. You see, the New Testament shows us where God finished the work of rescue. And we mostly know that part. But Genesis shows us where he promised to do that. Did you hear me? The New Testament shows us where God finished the work of rescue, but Genesis shows us where he promised that he would. The covenant secured it. Now, I confess that is a serious oversimplification of a lot of biblical content. But I do think it's a helpful one because it lets us see the shape of the story rather than all of those little details that ultimately don't entirely matter. Now, a couple key verses that I'll give you, and of course, narrowing this down is almost impossible, especially in a book as big as Genesis. But two key verses, Genesis 1:1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Then Genesis 12:3. In his promise with Abram, he says, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. And that promise to Abram is what I want to focus on today, this covenant agreement. So if you want to look in your own Bible, you can turn to Genesis 15. To this key passage. Now, as we prepare to go there, I want to warn you. Here's your disclaimer. Genesis 15 is equally strange and technical. And yet it's stunningly beautiful at the same time. Some have said that this is one of the most gospel-shaped passages in the entire Old Testament. And once you see why, I think you'll find a new appreciation for the book of Genesis and probably the whole Old Testament as a whole. Genesis 15, we're going to read the whole thing. After this, context here is Lot has been kidnapped by some crazy kings, and Abram has gone and saved him. So after this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless? And the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram said, you've given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir. Then the word of the Lord came to him. What grace! This man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir. He took him outside and said, look up at the sky, count the stars, if indeed you can count them. Then he said to him, so shall your offspring be. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. He also said to him, I'm the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land and take possession of it. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, how can I know that I will gain possession of it? So the Lord said to him, bring me a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. Right away, we have to think Abram's thinking things are about to get weird. So Abram brought all these to him, cut them in two, and arranged the halves opposite of each other. I absolutely love when we get details like this. The birds, however, he did not cut in half. That'll preach. Then birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Abram drove them away. As the sun was setting, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. Then the Lord said to him, "Know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated there." Of course, God is talking about Egypt here. "But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. You, however," talking about Abram, "will go to your ancestors in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the 4th generation your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure." That is a massively important sentence, by the way, that I don't have time to teach you. When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking fire pot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram and said, "To your descendants, I give this land, from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Kadamites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, Girgashites, and the Jebusites." Imagine being in Abram's sandals here. He is in a crisis of faith. He's left his home, his comfort, his safety, his ancestors, his legacy to follow a God that he cannot see, to a land that he does not yet own. God has promised him a legacy now, descendants like the stars. But Abram's old, and his wife is old, and they've never been able to have children before. And so he looks at his circumstances, and he looks at the promises God's making, and they don't match. And he asks the question that we all ask when we find ourselves in the dark. Sovereign Lord, how can I know? How can I know? Can you imagine how many times God has heard that question? How will I know? And as it so often is with us, God's answer to Abram's "how will I know" is not a speech. It's a demonstration of his power, a demonstration of his character. And even more than a demonstration, it's a ritual. It's a blood ritual that would have been common in Abram's day, and anyone reading this, 1500 BC or so, would have known exactly what was going on here. But we need to explain it a little bit. And look at the historical context that makes this not just weird or not just interesting, not just gross, but actually astonishing. So here's the background to this bizarre ceremony. So in the ancient Near East, you did not sign contracts like we do now. You cut covenants. And so if you wanted to make a life and death promise with someone, you would take sacrificial animals. A heifer, a goat, a ram, birds. And in the case of the bigger animals, you would split them down the middle. And you'd lay the bloody halves opposite of each other, building like a horror yellow brick road. Be a very narrow path, and the two parties that are making this agreement with each other, making this promise to one another, would walk the bloody path together. And by walking the pieces, they were saying to one another, if I break my word to you, if I fail to keep my promise on this deal, may I become like these animals. May I be cut off. You were literally putting your life on the line. And that's the background to what anyone living at the time of Abram or Moses would have understood in this ritual? Well, of course they're cutting a covenant. That's what you do. But as we go back to Genesis 15, we see that the sun is setting. And a dark, dreadful, thick darkness falls over Abram, which is, by the way, what happens when a holy God comes near a sinful person with no mediation. But then something remarkable happens. Abram doesn't stand up. He doesn't even bow down. He doesn't prepare himself. He doesn't try to hide. He doesn't squirm. He doesn't need an angel to say to him, "Oh, Abram, don't be afraid." He turns on his do not disturb and he goes to sleep. How many of you have fallen asleep like that when the thick and dreadful darkness comes over you? Not many. He turns on the do not disturb and he goes to sleep. He's completely passive. He's sidelined. He does nothing here. But suddenly in the darkness, a smoking fire pot and a blazing torch appear, which is God himself. The fancy word for this is theophany. When God would appear in a form that could be seen, he would materialize, so to speak. And then the unthinkable happens. God walks the bloody covenantal path alone. What was always done by both parties is done by God and God alone. Abram's asleep. He doesn't walk through the blood. He doesn't swear on his life. He doesn't commit to being cut off if the covenant is broken. But God does. And so even now, I expect for those with ears to hear, you feel the weight of that. This is Genesis 15. This isn't Matthew 27. There's a lot of story to get through, and we are already here in the bloody cutting off. God's saying in this moment, this does not depend on you. The promise does not rest on Abram's ability to stay faithful to the promise. The whole thing rests on God's character. As Abram sleeps, God declares really to the entire world, I am taking the entire burden of this promise on myself. And Abram, if your descendants fail, if you should break this covenant, I will be the one that bleeds. And so do you see it here, church? God designed it. Humanity disrupted it. And by Genesis 15, the covenant is securing it. And this bloody covenant, of course, points us directly to Jesus. So here are some direct parallels. Well, we have darkness. Genesis 15, we read a thick darkness falls. In Matthew 27, darkness covers the land as Jesus hangs on the cross. Because when a holy God comes near sin, it is dreadful. Then you have the forsaking. In Genesis, Abram is overwhelmed by this feeling of holy dread. And on the cross, Jesus cries out what Abram likely felt, my God, why have you forsaken me? This is dreadful. Then, of course, there's the obvious one, the cutting. In Genesis, God swears, I will be cut off if you or your descendants should break this promise. And on the cross, that oath is fulfilled. We broke the design. We invited the disruption. We deserve to bleed out and be cut off. But Jesus, the true seed of Abraham, the one of perfect faith, steps into the path of the curse that was on us. He takes our failure upon himself. And so this covenant ceremony in Genesis 15 wasn't placed in an ancient time capsule and buried down in the dust of Canaan. On to the next story. What happened is this capsule, this moment, this covenant went on and it went forward. And it was eventually superseded by Jesus Christ himself dying on our behalf. Not just a covenant, but the demonstration of the oath itself. This covenant moves forward. It finds fulfillment in Christ. Bible commentator, a man named Derek Kidner, I was reading this week. I like this. He said that this covenant, Genesis 15, this covenant, not Sinai, is the foundational one of the entire Old Testament because it speaks of grace, not law. Promise first, and then the law came. Only 15 chapters into the Bible, God is showing his heart in a way that humanity will talk about literally forever. Salvation would never depend on your effort or my effort. The law would come later to show us our need of salvation, but the promise came first to show us the grace of God that will get us there. So before we move into some concluding application, let me give you the Genesis in a sentences one more time. God's plan is to reconcile his people to himself, shouldering the cost of perfect obedience on our behalf. So 2026, we're all pretty smart now. We have AI and stuff. So what does Genesis actually offer us? Here's 3 immediate gifts. First, it reveals your beginning and mine. It tells you immediately you are not an accident. And we hope that we get to a certain age and know that to be true. But there's still something profoundly remarkable when we pause just long enough to really believe God made me on purpose. We are not accidents, and not only are we made on purpose, we bear the image of God. We are designed for his blessing, to know his blessing, to be conscious of his blessing, and also to be conduits of that blessing towards other people. My dog does not know the blessing of God. Somehow I do. It also reveals our problem. We're separated by a disruption that we cannot fix on our own. There's nothing we can do. But it also reveals the solution, that God is a good father who works through a covenant sealed in his own blood. It reveals our beginning, it reveals our problem, but it also reveals our solution. So here's some takeaways for your life today. First of all, you can stop walking the path of performance. And you can stop demanding that others walk the same. Many of us are tired from trying to earn God's approval. Even those of us who think we know better or do know better could probably quote book and verse, chapter and verse on why we know better. We would say we're saved by faith alone, by grace alone, and yet we still live as if we're saved by performance. We think that by being good Christian parents or good Christian spouses or good church attenders or generous and kind or holding good important jobs or contributing to our community, that somehow those things make us more safe with God. Well, I'm certainly doing better than that guy. We start to divide the world into good Christians and into those who sin differently than we do. Oh, well, my parents didn't get divorced. Good Christians. We behave our way in our minds to get into God's good book. And the result is always the same: anxiety, discouragement, and weariness. Because we end up living under our own impossible standard, which is what Jesus said would happen. To the measure you judge others by, you'll be judged yourself. And that's the other side of the coin. If we believe we need to walk a path of performance, well, we can be sure we will expect the same from others. And that's not just a personality quirk. Like, we need to stop excusing those types of things as being A-type. That's a fragmented heart that has not understood gracefully. It's a symptom of what we believe. So when we believe deep down that God's love rises and falls with our performance, we will inevitably treat others the same way. We don't just put ourselves under that standard, we put everybody else under the standard too. Harshness, impatience, constant disappointment in everybody. That's not just your temperament. That's not your Myers-Briggs number. That's probably an expression of what we think God is like. A performance-based view of God always creates a performance-based community. Did you hear me? A performance-based view of God always creates a performance-based community. A performance-based view of God will create a performance-based family. It will create a performance-based church. It will create a performance-based staff. But covenant grace creates a different kind of person. It creates a person who knows how to rest and therefore knows how to be gentle and gracious and let others do the same for one. Living as if perfect performance is possible and necessary is exhausting, and it leads to heart attacks. Seriously. For us and other people. We could say it this way: we're exhausted because we are still trying to walk through the pieces and demanding others do the same. This week I came across one of the clearest summaries of anxiety I've read. I've read a fair bit on this because I've wrestled with anxiety, I think, since I was about 6. This is from a pastor and author named Steve Cuss. He says, anxiety is generated when we think we need something in any particular moment that we don't actually need. This is true when our spouse doesn't do the garbage right, and we need it done a certain way. Ugh. This is true when we don't get respect the way we think we deserve. Ugh. But it's also true when we take over God's responsibility. When we try to manage outcomes, every outcome. When we try to control the future for ourselves and for others. When we try to see ourselves through a standard of excellence that's probably man-made and probably colored in by us. We feel it when we try to walk a covenant path to God's grace and approval that only God is big enough to walk. But the message of Genesis 15, and really the message of the entire story of the Bible, is that you can rest. Not sleep of laziness. Those of you that weren't allowed to sleep in on Saturdays. You can rest because of because what is of the greatest importance, your salvation, does not depend at all on you. Depends on God and God alone. How astonishing is it that while God swears an oath upon himself, Abram rests? I mean, I don't think my mind can fully appreciate this. I think it's only a work of the Holy Spirit that will allow me to absorb even a fraction of the brevity of this. Abram is asleep while God is making a covenant in his blood. I do remember, though, as a dad, many times when my girls were little, they're having a hard time falling asleep, facing all the common fears that little kids face. And the question that they would ask, and if you've had kids or if you've been a kid, you probably know this to be true. Common question. How long will you be awake for? Because somehow knowing for them that I'd be awake, dealing with my own anxiety, made them feel safe enough to sleep. Like, well, Dad will probably be awake all night, if we're being honest. Sleeping pills aren't working again. But I digress. To the extent that we believe that we are somehow safe in the covenantal grace of God, we can rest. Abram's asleep, but God is not. He's walking a bloody covenant path all by himself. Letting Abram sleep. And so your righteousness is not found in your ability to walk the path. It's based on trusting the one who walked the path for you. Well, you were still trying to process the dreaded darkness. When you feel like you're failing the test, remember that the only one who could have ever possibly passed the test already has. And so here's the challenge from this. Stop negotiating with God. Stop trying to cut your own deals through promised behavior and religious bargaining and spiritual performance. That's the way of the world. That's the way of exhaustion and weariness and Blue Mondays. It's not the way of the covenant. Remember, the Torah is the instruction for how to live because you are so radically loved. It is not the instruction book on how you might come to be loved. And so if cutting deals is our correction and our challenge, then our hope is that we get to rest well, that we can breathe. And like Abram, we can find peace even in thick and dreadful darkness, whether it's illness or financial strain or disillusionment with life or kid problems or family problems or parent problems or a spiritual wilderness, we can somehow rest. Why? Because the price was already sworn and paid. Specifically for the only thing that ultimately matters. If the thing of greatest importance has been dealt with, everything else is very small in comparison. Your bad day was not that bad, nor was mine. And by the way, we all have bad days. None of us are the exception there. The God who carries this promise on himself is the same God who says to you and me today, I am your shield, your defender, and I am your greatest reward. I am your prize. You see, you're not holding up the promise. Because I am.